Every Tom, Dick, and Harry knows Canada boasts one of the greatest naval fleets in the world today, with most of its technological advancements and innovations coming during the Second World War. But what about the First? What really happened when Canada's fleet was so small, so helpless, with just a handful of boats to fight or even defend its vast coastlines? Today we'll be celebrating the forgotten chapter of Canadian naval history, the infamous legacy of the Royal Canadian Navy's CC-class submarines during the First World War, and how its heartfelt story of failures and resilience shaped the nation's future. Just 4 years after it got formed, the Royal Canadian Navy was thrust into the greatest of tests. As part of the British Empire at the time, they were automatically at war with Germany in 1914, but at a severe disadvantage. Being new into the affairs of war, Canada's Navy was largely unfit, obsolete, and unprepared for war. They only had 2 under-equipped warships, with inexperienced Marines. At first, the burden of protecting Canada's coasts fell to Britain's Royal Navy. They became too occupied with investigating and gunning German squadrons, leaving Canada with little to no protection. Worse, rumors began to circulate saying German warships were heading towards Canada's west coast. HMCS Rainbow, with a partial crew and inadequate ammunition, was the only naval defense the nation had, and it would definitely have been destroyed by the German ships. Fortunately, this never happened. The Germans had little interest in raiding Canadian waters. In any case, Canada couldn't afford to be at Germany's mercy. The perceived threat hastened plans to beef up their defense, leading them to strange alternatives. In 1911, Chile ordered 2 submarines from the Electric Boat Company of New Jersey. They were built by Seattle Construction and Seattle and Dry Dock Company. But after a few sea trials, Chile rejected them for not meeting performance standards and fell behind on payments. With World War I on the horizon, the president of Seattle shipyard took advantage of the situation and offered British Columbia the opportunity to buy the boats. Sir Richard McBride, the province's premier, bought the idea and proposed the purchase to Canada. However, with no immediate response, McBride decided to buy them using provincial funds. On the 3rd of August 1914, the submarines secretly left Seattle, as the clearance papers for the boats had not been gotten at that time, and the deal was finalized the next day for $1.15 million. Following tradition, when 2 British E-class submarines were renamed AE-1 and AE-2 by adding an A to signify Australia's ownership, the 2 submarines heading to Canada had 2 C's added to their names to signify both Canada and their class. Initially praised by Prime Minister Robert Borden, the deal, however, came under scrutiny. The former minister William Pugsley and other notable critics raised questions concerning the high sum paid by Canada and British Columbia. Rumors also spread that J.V. Patterson, president of Seattle Construction, made a huge profit. After a royal commission was launched to investigate the claims, the Electric Boat Company admitted the submarines had dangerous diving characteristics and had been working on fixes, but the sale occurred before these could be implemented due to the U.S. neutrality in the war. Additionally, they testified that Peterson indeed made profits from the purchase, as the price he paid to Electric Boat was lower than what Canada had paid him. However, the commission ruled in favor of McBride, citing the urgency of the purchase, U.S. neutrality, and Admiralty's recommendation to go ahead with the deal. That said, it's worth adding that when the submarine arrived in Halifax, it quickly became clear that they were unfit for immediate deployment, as both vessels needed significant engine overhauls. But despite their condition, the Admiralty initially ordered them to be prepared for service in Europe, specifically the Mediterranean. However, after learning about the poor condition, the Admiralty reconsidered and redirected the submarines to serve in coastal defense along Canada's eastern coast. While undergoing repairs in Halifax, both submarines survived the Halifax explosion without damage. The Royal Canadian Navy then developed a plan to use the 2 subs for anti-submarine training with surface vessels. This training took place on Cape Breton Island, where CC-2 and Shearwater were sent to Bras d'Or Lake to train trawler and drifter crews in using their hydrophones. Finding a better purpose, the submarines spent the remainder of the war as training vessels and never went on a patrol again before the armistice. As anticipated, the 2 CC-class submarines shared several characteristics, including a torpedo tube positioned in the stern and the absence of any gun armament. However, they were not completely identical. The Electric Boat Company used 2 different designs despite equipping both with the same internal machinery. Unlike her sister boat CC-2, CC-1 was constructed using the 19E design. It had 5 18-inch torpedo tubes, 4 at the front and 1 at the rear, giving it a different hull shape. Yet, both of them were equipped with Whitehead Mk4 18-inch torpedoes, which had a range of 1,000 yards at 25 knots. But hey, given the only available supply of these torpedoes in Canada came from HMCS Niobe, getting them to the sea boats took some time. The submarines had a surface displacement of 313 tons and 412 tons when submerged, with a beam of 15 feet. CC-1 was 144 feet long and equipped with 5 torpedo tubes, carrying 5 torpedoes. In contrast, CC-2 was slightly longer at 152 feet, with 3 torpedo tubes and an armament of 6 torpedoes. For deep dives, both submarines were capable of reaching depths of 200 feet, and unlike modern submarines, the main ballast and trim tanks were located inside the vessel. With manned 6-cylinder diesel engines, built under license in the US, the CC class could carry over 5,000 gallons of diesel fuel. And although their design speed was 13 knots on the surface and slightly over 10 knots submerged, the CC-1 reached speeds of 15.1 knots over the measured mile. CC-2's engines were more reliable though. Speaking of which, may I add that the diesel-electric propulsion system was also a big improvement over the steam-powered designs? Unlike their old counterparts, the use of diesel engines enabled the submarines to recharge their batteries while on the surface, switching to electric power for quieter, more covert movement underwater. It also increased range and makes them more reliable for extensive missions. Alongside HMCS Rainbow, CC-1 and CC-2 were the only Canadian warships responsible for defending Canada's west coast from 1914 to 1917. They passed through the Panama Canal and became the first Canadian or British warship to pass while flying the White Ensign. In hindsight, they did their jobs perfectly. The CC-class submarines patrolled the waters off the Canadian coast and acted as deterrents against any German incursion into Canadian territory. Yes, they never engaged in direct combat with enemy vessels, but you'd be hard-pressed to say their presence alone wasn't critical in maintaining a defensive posture. The sight of submarines operating off the coast of British Columbia alone gave a sense of security, both for the military and the public. With German raiders lurking in the Pacific and Canadian defenses stretched thin, who knows what might have happened if the submarines hadn't been there to serve as a deterrent. Just think about it. If the German Navy was way better than Canada's, wouldn't the latter leaving its doors wide open be foolish? Enemies could have exploited the vulnerability, launched attacks on vital trade routes, or even raided coastal towns. But don't take this to mean the Canadian submarines were unbeatable or close to perfect. No sir, they had a couple of flaws and were plagued with unfortunate events from the get-go. On the 20th of June 1917, the 3 vessels departed from Esquimalt. While off Cape Blanco, the fleet encountered a gale that caused CC-2 to roll severely, leading to seawater contamination of its batteries, which resulted in half of the crew becoming incapacitated due to chlorine exposure. Worse, the rough seas caused both submarine propellers to lift out of the water, which led to the engines over-revving. This instability ultimately caused the battery cells to deteriorate, leading to short circuits and electrical fires, the latter of which forced the crews to operate only the diesel engine at the time, as the other was typically under repair. CC-2, however, continued to operate until reaching San Francisco, after which both submarines were towed to San Diego. Due to their condition, the fleet could only make short stops along the coast, requiring a repair stop at Kingston, Jamaica. After leaving Kingston, the ship spent 5 days at Charleston, South Carolina for additional repairs. Although they attempted to depart, they returned to Charleston for further maintenance. But, like the tribulations weren't already enough, the submarines faced a huge storm after leaving again and had to limp to Norfolk, Virginia. But this brings us to the mechanical problems of the CC class itself. The first to be discovered was instability during dives. The submarines, Episode CC-2, experienced uncontrollable negative buoyancy when ballast tanks were vented. And of course, if the tanks were left partially filled, the boats risked dangerous nose or tail dives. To fix this problem, the weight had to be reduced, leading to the removal of non-essential stores, fuel, and spare parts. But while this saved the crisis, it also limited the class's patrol range to just a few days. The second problem, however, was the fact that the cylinders in the diesel engines had a nasty tendency to overheat. And this is a big issue for submarines, because when engine cylinders overheat, they reduce the efficiency of combustion, causing a drop in power output. In turn, it hinders the boat's ability to either maneuver quickly or maintain speed. Additionally, when not checked for a long time, excessive heat can cause thermal stress and can lead to the cracking of critical components, like pistons and cylinder walls, which causes oil leaks, increased friction, and even complete engine failure. Finally, in confined submarine environments, overheating can also create dangerous conditions, like an increased risk of fire or damage to surrounding equipment. So you see, when left unchecked, mechanical issues like these can severely impact a submarine's operational effectiveness, or worse. So, what do you think the Canadian Navy did to address this issue? Well, surprisingly, nothing at all. The issue was never resolved, and the engine cylinders would eventually crack after 6 hours of running at full speed due to flaws in early engine design and metallurgical weaknesses. However, they were able to fix the issue of emptying the tanks during diving or surfacing. It wasn't too brain-racking and was solved by replacing the faulty valves. Once refitted, the submarines carried out various patrols and training missions along the west coast. After the war came to an end, the Royal Navy transferred H-class submarines, H-14 and H-15, to Canada. But given the latter's navy couldn't operate both classes at the same time, they decided to place the CC class in reserve. In 1920, both CC-1 and CC-2 submarines were offered for sale, along with HMCS Niobe, as part of a disposal package. 5 years later, all 3 boats were sold for scrap and subsequently dismantled. Looking back though, I can't help but feel a sense of pride here. Despite the shortcomings, mechanical failures, and the fact that the CC-class submarines were sidelined from frontline duties, their importance in the early history of the Royal Canadian Navy should never be overlooked. They were the foundation of Canada's naval prowess in World War I, and their presence along the coast, however limited, provided a crucial deterrent to potential German attacks, as discussed earlier. Finally, the class not only served as a stepping stone for Canadian naval innovation, but also helped spark the vision that would drive the Royal Canadian Navy's growth in the years to come. So hey, the next time someone says you need to sink ships to become a war hero, tell them to come over here and learn all about the Royal Canadian CC class. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when a new video drops. And while you're at it, don't just stop here. Check out the channel for more amazing videos like this.